But our next presenter is Reverend Dr. Hieromonk Damaskinos Olkinuora, who is a lecturer in systematic theology and patristics at the University of Eastern Finland, a research fellow at the University of Regensburg, and a member of the monastic brotherhood of Xenophontos on Mount Athos. His scholarship investigates Middle Byzantine hymnography and homiletics, as well as the devotion of to the Theotokos.
Thank you. Reverend Hierarch, fathers, sister, friends. As Father Chrysostomos, I also come from the monastic republic of the Holy Mountain, also called the Garden of the Theotokos, where the monastic devotion to the person of Virgin Mary is particularly prominent, not least through her wonder-working icons in each monastery. The Theotokos brought the Logos into this world, was the leader of the early church, according to later sources, but also acts today. She is our protector, our mother, and our abbess in the Holy Mountain. Even though this aspect of monastic spirituality is self-evident for us Orthodox monastics today, it has been quite understudied in scholarship thus far, especially in the Greek-speaking world. There's a bit more scholarship on the Latin devotion to the Mother of God by monastics. My talk today is an expansion from my doctoral dissertation on the feast of the entrance of the Virgin into the temple, which I think is the feast par excellence of her monastic aspects. And also this talk is a foretaste of my hopefully second monograph I'm now preparing on this topic. First, as a brief introduction, I would like to give you only a very rough overview of the Byzantine literary sources that speak of the Mother of God as an ascetic or a monastic. These two words are not synonyms, but sometimes they overlap. Everything begins in the Gospel of Luke, actually, where she is one of the ascetical characters among many others. This is particularly shown in Archangel Gabriel's phrase during Annunciation when he says to Mary, "The Holy Spirit shall overshadow you." Ascetics are indeed spirit bearers, also in the late Jewish traditions. She also notes her own virginity, something the later exegetes saw as a sign of her virginal vows, and not only of her young age or inexperience. For example, Gregory of Nyssa notes that this phrase, that I do not know man, signifies that she actually gave vows of virginity. The ascetical aspect of Mary's life is also prominent in the Proto-Evangelium of James, a highly influential apocryphon, or what I would prefer to call quasi-canonical scripture, dating from the late 2nd century, most probably. With the blossoming of monasticism in the 4th century, we have explicit texts that show the Theotokos as a model for monastics, not only in the works of Athanasius the Great, directed to Alexandrian female ascetics, but also in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, where Abba Pimin wants to imitate Mary's compunction by Christ's cross, and also in the Cappadocian tradition. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the approach to Mary seems to have been more centered on the Christological debates of the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon, but also addressing her role as the protectress of the growing capital, the Queen of Cities. The tradition of an ascetical Mary did, however, not disappear, but it was less prominent. It began to bloom again during the iconoclast controversy and its aftermath, a period when much liturgical material and many homilies and hymns were composed in her honor. From the 9th century onward, a group of texts nowadays called the Lives of the Virgin emerge. They present the first full so-called biographies of the Theotokos. They're not biographies by modern standards, reaching from her birth to her death. The oldest life, which is written by an abbot called Epiphanios of the Kallistrato monastery, dating from the early 9th century, mentions in the introduction of the text that the whole purpose of presenting the life of the Theotokos is to present her as a model to the male monastics of the community in the way they should lead their ascetical lives. This new blossoming of the monastic Mary in the 10th century manifests itself most clearly in the foundation of the Holy Mountain of Athos and in the fact that many of its churches were dedicated to the Mother of God already in the 10th century, as well as in her apparition to St. Peter the Athonite, who was the earliest Athonite monastic we know by name, and in the late years of Byzantium, in the thoughts of St. Gregory Palamas, who sees Mary as an ideal hesychast, as we will see also today. In the present paper, I will not concentrate on these narrative treatises, but rather spend time on the liturgical material that sometimes speaks of these monastic aspects in metaphors and poetic images, and often between the lines. They do, however, echo the development which is present in narrative genres of the same time period. Since my time is limited, I will reflect on two monastic virtues of Mary's life, enclosure and discernment. First, enclosure. The enclosed space in the life of a monastic is a world of its own. It is the arena of personal encounter with the divinity, of private prayer, vigils, prostrations, tears, contemplation, and study. In the passion narratives of martyrs, imprisonment is a recurrent theme that takes the place of a monastic enclosure. Even in this involuntary enclosure, we could say, martyrs can contemplate, receive divine encouragement and sanctification before their martyrdom. In the same spirit, in the life of the Mother of God, all the miraculous events happen in enclosure. After her birth, according to the Proto-Evangelium of James, she was kept in enclosure to keep her ritually pure. When she was 3 years old, she entered the 9-year enclosure in the Temple of Jerusalem, most importantly in the Holy of Holies, which already in Jewish temple spirituality had become the most essential place for divine encounters. Her divine Son was conceived in the embodied enclosure of Mary's womb that kept its enclosed quality even after his birth. And he was born in the enclosure of a cave, according to the Proto-Evangelium of James, echoing his death, his tomb, and his resurrection. Finally, her miraculous dormition happened in the enclosure of her home, turned as if into a sanctuary, as we read from many dormition narratives. But the most monastic of Mary's enclosures is the one in the Temple of Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies, as I said, the entry into which is celebrated in the Byzantine Church on November 21st. The different lives of the Virgin describe her obedient and contemplative lifestyle in the temple, and quite accurately, Metropolitan Callistus Ware has called this feast the Feast of Mary's Silence. The textual sources present a twofold monastic mode in the person of Mary. She is both a Cenobitic ascetic, living in the temple community of virgins, but also a hermit who is taught directly by God without any male teachers, a fact emphasized already by Athanasius the Great in the 4th century. The entrance narrative includes a procession of virgins that accompanies Mary, a procession that is seen by the liturgical authors as the typological fulfillment of the wedding procession described in Psalm 45, according to the Septuagint. We do not have much historical evidence for such a monastic community of virgins having existed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a fact that many theologians use as evidence for the ahistoricity of the events of the entrance, but it is actually not completely impossible either. In the account of the destruction of Jerusalem's temple by the Roman troops, there is a description of the temple virgins throwing themselves into fire. The main task of these virgins, according to these narratives, was to spin purple thread with which to weave the veil of the temple. And this is also the handiwork that Proto-Evangelium of James assigns to Mary after her life in the temple. Therefore, many narrative sources, such as the Latin apocryphon called Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, give much emphasis to Mary's perfect communal life. She is a perfect Cenobitic ascetic. The 15th century preacher George Scholarius draws up a list of Mary's monastic virtues on his homily on the entrance. She acquired, I quote, abstinence, sobriety, mildness, undistraction of mind, severity, negligence of glory, gentleness, moderation, dedication of the oppressed flesh to pains, the elevation of the mind towards God, end of quote. But perhaps even more emphasis, especially in the hymnography for the Feast of the Entrance, is given to her eremitical life in the sanctuary, where she experienced her mystagogical initiation to the things above. In the Vespers, her mother Anne exhorts her before entering the temple, "Go, child, go to him who gave thee unto me. Be unto him an offering and a sweet-smelling incense. Go into the place which none may enter. Learn its mysteries and prepare thyself to become the pleasing and beautiful dwelling place of Jesus, who grants the world great mercy. The culmination of the liturgical descriptions of the monastic training of the Theotokos was in Gregory Palamas' description of these spiritually fruitful years, again in a homily dedicated to the Feast of the Entrance, and I quote, "Thus, looking for this, the Virgin found the sacred silence, ησυχία, as Palamas says, as her guide, the rest of the mind and universe, the forgetting of earthly things, the initiation of things above, the preserving of thoughts towards better ones. And thus monastics purify in their hearts through sacred silence, perceiving God in spiritual contemplation. A concise demonstration of this process is the Virgin herself, who was dedicated to silence since, let us say, her infancy. From everyone only she, having practiced silence marvelously since her childhood, gave birth to the God-man Logos without knowing man." End of quote. So we can see in this passage that the Virgin had an active will to achieve a state of spiritual sobriety, and she indeed guarded her thoughts, logismi, according to the earlier monastic traditions. So, for Palamas, Mary is an ascetic par excellence and therefore a unique model for monastic imitation. While dwelling in the sanctuary, in this utmost solitary place where even the high priest could enter only once a year, Mary was taught directly by God with divine teachings, but also by hearing the scriptures being read in the temple every Sabbath. Palamas goes on by saying, I quote, "She listened carefully and with a great attention both to those books written by Moses and those by other prophets when the whole people gathered together every Saturday outside the temple." End of quote. This theological training, as we shall come to see, was of essential significance for the later stages of her life, because Mary was not unaware of salvation history when the Annunciation took place, and this will change our whole understanding of Annunciation. There is also one peculiar passage in the Proto-Evangelium of James that describes how Mary received sustenance from an angel's hand. This angel, according to the hymnography of the feast, was Gabriel. The name is not mentioned in the Proto-Evangelium. And we know Gabriel not only from the Annunciation, but also from the miraculous birth of Mary. In the Vespers of the feast, we hear that Gabriel then was sent to thee, O Virgin all defiled, to bring thee food. While the Proto-Evangelium also does not specify what this sustenance was, the liturgical material is explicit. It was bread. This is why we hear references such as she receives bread from the hand of a divine angel, or she is nourished by the hand of the angel as she will give birth unspeakably to the heavenly bread for our sake. This communion with an angel, as Gregory Palamas puts it, is a sign of her angelic lifestyle. The monastic life is, after all, also called angelic life. The homilists of the Feast of the Entrance also see this bread to be a sign of Mary's ultimate fasting. She has even superseded human nourishment and enjoys already mystically the sanctification of Holy Eucharist before the Eucharist took place. Let us now discuss the virtue of discernment in the Theotokos' life. Thanks to her spiritual training in the Temple of Jerusalem, she became familiar with discerning spirits. The sermon by Tarasios of Constantinople on the Entrance mentions that as a result of her spiritual struggles, she was able to chase off demons, full of the divine spirit, and she understood the deceitfulness of the spider's web of worldly matters. Since Mary was so full of wisdom, according to the traditions that link her with the ascetical life in the temple, she knew well that a virgin would give birth to a divine son. She had already met Gabriel several times in the sanctuary, and therefore this angel appearing to him was not some unknown apparition, not even during the Annunciation. In Tarasios' sermon, Mary even praised to God during her stay in the Holy of Holies with these words, I quote, "I sing to you, O highest ruler of all, for you have removed the curse of our foremother Eve, and through your ineffable compassion you shall send your only begotten Son to the earth, so that he would commune with men. Therefore, I shall become his pure and spotless dwelling place." End of quote. According to the 10th century Georgian life of the Virgin, she even hears a voice before her betrothal to Joseph, informing her of her future task as the Mother of God. In this framework, the narrative of the Annunciation must be seen in a completely new light, as I said. Mary's hesitation in Luke's Gospel has to be interpreted to fit this history of foreknowledge. Some fathers, such as Andrew of Crete, even see the incarnation happening before Gabriel's arrival, seeing Mary's agreement with the incarnation only as an oral confirmation of a thing that has already happened. This implies that it is Mary's spirit-filling years in the temple that make her conceive. In other words, her consent is given already during this ascetical struggle. But why then does Mary hesitate to accept Gabriel's message during the Annunciation? The present liturgical books include a canon for the festal matins of Annunciation that actually consists of 2 separate poems, one of them consisting of 6 and one of them of 2 odes. Both of them are a dialogue between Mary and Gabriel. The tradition of such liturgical dialogues, used both in hymns and homilies, is an old one and probably derives from Semitic poetry. They feature prominently in the works of the 4th century Syrian poet Ephraim, as we well know. So in order to see the Middle Byzantine understanding of the Annunciation, we must look at these dialogical texts. Many of them describe Gabriel's hesitance to deliver the message given to him by God, since it is incomprehensible for him too. And some of these texts are quite cute, I would say, in the way they describe Gabriel standing before Mary's room and thinking how to enter, because God had told him not to scare Mary. And he's thinking, for example, in the sermon by Andrew, that should I run in? And there's like, no, she will get scared. Should I just go through the door because I'm an angel? I don't need to open the door. That's like, yeah, she will think that maybe there's something bad. So then he decides that he walks briskly in and says, rejoice. So this is Gabriel's process. However, it doesn't end up well. Germanos of Constantinople, the 8th century preacher, in his sermon on the Annunciation, puts the following greeting of joy to Gabriel's mouth. So Gabriel says, "Hearken, O glorious one, hearken to the secret words of the High One. You shall conceive in your womb and give birth to a son, and you shall call him Jesus. Arm yourself for Christ's presence then, for I have come to bring you the good news that have been foresaid before the constitution of the world." But how does the Theotokos answer to this in Germanos' homily? "O man, leave my city and my fatherland, leave. Abandon hastily my room. Who you speak to me, go far away from my doors, and do not bring such glad tidings to my lowliness." So the answer is not only confused, but here it's actually aggressive. And Mary says, "O anthrope," which is kind of insult. It's a term used in Older Greek for slaves and servants. And Mary says she does not want to receive glad tidings in her lowliness. The same expression can be seen in the iconographic tradition of the feast, where you can see in many Annunciation icons that Mary is kind of pushing Gabriel away rather than listening to him. But the sermon's words reveal the reason for the reluctance to converse with the angel. She's trying to discern whether or not this revelation is of divine origin, and through this action she links herself with the monastic tradition again. St. John of Damascus calls discernment, greater than any other virtue, the queen and crown of all the virtues. And this virtue is discussed extensively in ascetical literature, as we know, but especially in the Ladder by St. John of Sinai, where there are 2 chapters dedicated to discernment. St. John states, I quote, "Those who wish to learn the will of the Lord must first mortify their own will. Then, having prayed to God with faith and honest simplicity, and having asked the fathers or even the brothers with humility of heart and no thought of doubt, they should accept their advice as from the mouth of God, even if their advice be contrary to their own view, and even if those consulted are not very spiritual. For God is not unjust and will not lead astray souls who with faith and innocence humbly submit to the advice and judgment of their neighbor." End of quote. So according to John, discernment can be achieved only with obedience. This is the only way to receive this grace. Even though the liturgical material emphasizes Mary's eremitical life, as I said, there are many other narratives that point out her obedience to others in the Temple of Jerusalem. In other words, she has followed this monastic principle of acquiring discernment through humility and obedience. But even in the liturgical material, she is clear about her ascetical lifestyle having enabled Christ's incarnation. In the festal canon of the Annunciation, which I referred to above, she states, I quote, "Since then I am purified in soul and body by the Spirit, be it unto me according to thy word, may God dwell in me." End of quote. In this same canon, the virtue of discernment becomes apparent, especially in the Pauline form of discerning spirits. Mary suspects Gabriel is not an angel of light, but of darkness. This is the reason for her hesitation. Mary says in the canon, "I am filled with joy at thine words, yet I am afraid. I fear lest thou deceivest me as Eve was deceived, and leadest me far from God. Yet behold, thou criest out, O all ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord." So she's confused, that she's worried that this might be a demonic apparition, but this guy is praising God. Saint Barsanuphius, the 6th century spiritual guide, commands, I quote, "Do nothing without counsel, even if it appears to be good to you, for the light of the demons is later revealed as darkness. If then you hear or think or see something with the slightest turmoil in your heart, then learn that this comes from the demons." End of quote. In order not to fall into this trap, in the Annunciation dialogue, Mary both examines herself, explores her own sentiments, and tests the one who speaks with her. Gabriel acknowledges Mary's worry and confirms that his message is one of joy and not of turmoil in the canon. I quote, "Thou hast well said that this matter is hard to grasp. Obey then the words of thine own lips. Doubt not as though it were deceitful, but believe in this thing as very truth. For I cry rejoicing, O all ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord." End of quote. It is noteworthy that Gabriel here offers his praise to Lord as a token for his words. A demonic spirit would not be able to praise God in this way, especially in rejoicing. And as the next stanza of the canon shows, Mary is content with this evidence and the fruits of the angel's message. He does not cause turmoil but joy. Therefore Mary utters, I quote, "Thou dost appear to me to speak the truth," answered the Virgin, "for thou hast come as an angel messenger, bringing joy to all." End of quote. So, we have seen how explicitly the liturgical material lays out before the eyes of believers a Theotokos who lives and acts like a monastic. But what should we make of this? Should we be concerned about the historical accuracy of these accounts or the message they convey? In previous scholarship, views on this matter have differed. Luigi Gamberon, in his famous survey on the patristic texts on the Theotokos, takes a somewhat negative stance and states, I quote, "When one sets out to find personal models to imitate, there is always the risk that these will be manipulated to conform to preconceived ideals. This also happens in the case of Mary, whose authentic image, traced in sober but marveling lines by the Gospels, has at times been retouched by religious groups looking for an affirmation and sublimation of their ascetical objectives." End of quote. This sounds like we're a cult, monastics forging the scriptures. But on the other hand, we know the popularity of Mary's person that manifested itself as an extremely rich devotion to her in the Eastern Empire. She was a suffering mother, an ascetical virgin, and a champion leader. So she had both male and female qualities, both virginal and maternal qualities. Even though the Byzantine fathers were concerned with the historicity of the events of salvation history, they also looked for a synchronic interpretation of the scriptures. In other words, they wanted to explore what the scriptures mean to people at all times, in all places. And the Mother of God as a person is not only a narrative in the past, she is always present among us. As Germanos of Constantinople exclaims to the Theotokos in his sermon on the Dormition, I quote, "You dwell among us still in the Spirit. Your great role as our protector is the chief mark of your presence among us. All of us hear your voice, and all of our voices come to your attentive ears. Your care is for all people, so that even if our eyes may be prevented from seeing you, all Holy One, you love to dwell in the midst of us all, and you show yourself in a variety of ways to those who are worthy of you." End of quote. This is why she shows herself to monastics as a monastic, even in our days, and this is why monastics carry their prayers to her, first among mortals. We are here to fill ourselves with the Spirit, and through this action, to make our own soul a virginal mother. In the words of Origen, I conclude, quote, "Every incorrupt and virgin soul, having conceived by the Holy Spirit, in order to give birth to the will of the Father, is a mother of Jesus." Thank you.